Dark Australian forces refuse to save the children. Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. Hello, John.
Hello, sir.
A dark subject today.
A very dark subject. To be honest, I'm pretty pissed off with something that's happened to me in the last 48 hours that we've been sort of leading our audience up to. And it's now time to, I think, call out what I think is systemic corruption inside the federal parliament. What I can say definitively is that in this country, we think we are free, but in reality, there are certain things that cannot be said. So in the last couple of months, we've talked about this inquiry by the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. We talked about the claims of ASIO that extremism is rising in Australia. We just put out actually a Twitter image from Zero Hedge saying that the US is now also saying anti-government extremism is the top threat. And I think just before we started recording, you said that it is the same narrative coming out of the UK.
Yes, absolutely. So it seems to me that this is a bit of a coordinated positioning around the world.
Yes. So what I think I can say is that rather than the part of the premise of my submission to the committee was that the reason why there is an increase in whether you want to call it extremist talk or flamboyant chatter on social media is because trust has collapsed. People no longer trust the establishment because of a whole host of factors. And yet, what I have experienced in the last 48 hours is that Parliament basically has shown their hand as to they want to effectively control what we think, what we say, what we can petition government on, and if we say things or do things that they don't like, then they either dismiss us or shut us down.
And what I think you're saying, John, is that there is a small area within which we can still sort of freely roam with opinion and comment, right? But we keep hitting now boundaries that weren't there a few years ago. And in fact, that field of play has got more and more and more compressed as the government has effectively put more and more fortress elements around it, to the point where, in fact, free speech and our freedoms are very restricted.
Yes, and that is going to become even more tightly controlled moving forward because in the last few years, I think social media and the YouTube and the internet has allowed people to become awake to a whole host of factors that were previously not known, but now they're trying to crack down on that form of communication by saying it's either extremism or disinformation or that it's not to be trusted.
And it's worth saying, John, I think a few years ago, people could control the message because they could always slap a notice through the press and through the media and stop things getting out, right? But effectively, the social media channels and the other ways of sharing information now means that was debilitated in its ability to control. So now they're trying to reassert the situation to try and bring that back under control again.
Yes, although just before we get into this, I just want to note, so when you talk about slapping a notice, so there is a difference. So in the UK, you have D notices in which the government or the palace can actually stop things to be communicated to the British people.
Yep.
I think from a legal point of view, Australia does not have the D notice system. So that is an important thing. But the key point is that whether people want to criticise the palace, the royal family, the government, in the intelligence services or elements of the financial sector, the elite running the banking system, these elements want you to keep your mouth shut. And that's why they put a whole bunch of crap on TV that actually is not informing the public, but actually distracting the public.
Yeah, misdirection. Look over there, enjoy the stuff on Netflix and everything else, but don't worry about the real critical issues. We'll just worry about those quietly on the side, right?
Indeed. So Michael, I want to get to what happened to me.
Yep.
A couple of weeks ago, I put in my submission to the inquiry, and I did it in a way that I submitted my submissions for the cash transaction ban, as well as the bail-in the bail-in law that was proposed by Senator Roberts. So there is a set methodology of how you should go about doing these things. You've done numerous of them.
Yep.
I've done numerous of them. They've always been accepted, and they have been accepted as a submission, and they have been published. And obviously with the cash transaction ban, I was invited to testify to the committee. Now, on this occasion, I got an email from the Secretariat of the committee. Now, this is a different committee to the Economics Committee, but let's put slide 1 up on the screen. And this is what it was said to me. Thank you for your document you have provided to the Parliamentary Joint Committee for Intelligence and Securities Inquiry into Extremist Movements and Radicalisation in Australia. The document you have provided has been noted by the committee and accepted as correspondence. Now, why is this important? Because when it's correspondence, as opposed to accepted as a submission, the first thing is that it's not published. So the public don't get to see what I actually had to say. So that's part one. But the more important part is that correspondence doesn't have to be considered as evidence. So they can note it, but they don't actually have to refer to correspondence in the committee report. Now, the big scandal that I saw this morning as I was looking at the inquiry website is, so we're recording on Saturday, is that there's only 7 submissions which have been published by the committee. Now, unlike the cash ban, where we were able to generate more than 2,500 submissions, dare I say that they've had almost 2 weeks to look at the submissions. I don't think there was a avalanche of work for the committee secretariat to do. So they've only published 7, and all 7 they're all from government agencies. So they're either federal agencies or departments, or state government police, or state governments. But any submissions from the public, whether controversial or not, have to date not been published, not accepted as evidence, not accepted as submission. And so I actually was quite shocked that my submission, which I thought was actually a quite serious submission that looked into a number of these issues as to why do we have this extremism in Australia, that they just said, thank you, but go away. Now, I actually then emailed, so I actually, before responding, I called a few people across the country who have expertise, having previously worked in Parliament, and I did speak to someone who actually currently works in Parliament, and I said, well, this seems highly unusual to me, so what are my options? So the best course of action, I was told, was to write back to the committee and actually ask why it was accepted as correspondence by the committee, and whether the decision can be reversed. So that I did that, and I did say that on previous occasions I did some very explicit things. For example, producing a properly documented, a properly formatted document, formally addressing the committee, addressing the terms of reference, coming up with a series of recommendations, and then obviously saving it as a standalone independent PDF. And I've found that to be quite important, as opposed to just sending an email to the committee. And they have a formal lodgement process. So I followed that, and I got the submission within the time frame. So this is what I've done in the past. This is what I've done in this inquiry, and I documented all of this and said, well, I followed your rules. So why was it not accepted as a submission? So let's go to slide 2. So this is what they came back to me and said, Dear Mr. Adams, thank you for your email. The committee's deliberations are private and confidential. It takes various matters into consideration when considering potential submissions to the committee. For more information about making submissions to inquiries, please see here. The committee's decisions in this regard are final. So basically, no justification for why my point of view is or can't be accepted as evidence. And that there's no opportunity for redress. There's no opportunity for any type of discussion. The committee's just basically said, well, we don't like what you have to say, therefore we're not going to consider it in terms of evidence. And it seems to me, given what we just talked about, how the United States law enforcement, as well as the UK, is saying that extremism is the top threat to national security, it seems to me that the fix is in terms of this whole agenda about so-called right-wing extremism, and that if you say anything or if you try to present a counter narrative or counter evidence, they don't want to hear it. And to me, I just find that outrageous that a parliamentary committee that is supposed to actually consider the evidence of the public, and obviously part of an inquiry process is to test the evidence of the government or various state or federal government, and to actually come to, well, what is the truth of the matter? But on this occasion, they don't want to examine counter evidence or counter narratives. They just have a fixed position that we have this so-called explosion in right-wing white Australian extremism, and this has to be sort of dealt with in one form or another. And for some people, they continue to point to Christchurch. Now that obviously did happen, and that's a very serious security matter. But as I've said to a number of people, I don't think we can point to an explosion of domestic white terrorism in Australia as a phenomena. Are people talking in a more flamboyant manner on social media? Sure, I can accept that. But why is that happening? And is there anything that we can do to cool the tempers down and actually have a more peaceful and civil society?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? Because we've argued before, I think, John, that there is a reason why there is more noise about, right? And partly it's because of people's dissatisfaction with how things are going politically at the moment and economically, I guess, as well. But I think the other point to make is that it used to be the case that the government was seen as responsible and seen as caring and seen as something that actually had our best interests at heart. I think that's all gone now. I mean, I think the government is looking after its own. It's got its own agenda, and anything that trips over the line, they're not interested in. I'd also say, of course, your submission was extremely long. Maybe they just couldn't be able to read it all, but I don't know whether that's also part of it.
Well, I mean, the thing is, so it was a 35-page submission. Now, on the bail-in inquiry, my submission was 26 pages.
Yeah.
So and they published that in full. So so it seems to be, if that is the matter, slightly inconsistent there, but obviously that's what they didn't say that to me. Now, it is interesting, I have to say, Martin, that the Australian Communication Media Authority was one of the 7 people who put in a submission, and that was published.
Yes.
And one of the things that they highlighted in their submission is this plan that they announced last year, which I was unaware of until I read their submission today, was that they are now working with the digital platform community, which is YouTube, Facebook, Google, and other digital providers which Australians use, to develop what they call a voluntary code of conduct around disinformation. So basically, they're saying that the issue is spreading and the growth of disinformation, and the voluntary code of conduct, and I've got it here in front of me. It says provide safeguards against harms that may arise from disinformation, disrupt advertising or monetary incentives for disinformation, increase transparency over measures taken to combat disinformation, empower consumers to make better informed choices around digital content. So the question I have is, in this whole context of people are being more extreme apparently in what they say, well, who gets to decide what is disinformation and what is real information? Because let's put this on the screen. Let's remind our audience. Back in 2019, Mr. Aaron Patrick from the Australian Financial Review called you and I conspiracy theorists because of our interpretation of this $10,000 cash transaction ban, and why we thought this was linked to unconventional monetary policy, because we cited the International Monetary Fund and other global institutions and their academic work, and we were called conspiracy theorists. Well, yet because we had YouTube, because we had the ability to engage thousands of Australians across the country, it took us 16 months, but we were able to defeat that particular law. Well, if we have this voluntary code of conduct around disinformation, who knows, maybe as we go forward, if you and I were to do a show about a proposal before Parliament, they could say that it's not just the Financial Review, but YouTube, or the government may say to YouTube, under your code of conduct, Adams and North are now pushing disinformation. We want you to shut them down. So again, there are, and I have to say, we're going to go through 10 scandals that I cited. Now, I cited a lot of scandals in my submission as to reasons why trust has collapsed. all of these scandals and all of the other issues that I raised had footnotes galore, 60 footnotes, and everything that I put there have been acknowledged by the mainstream media. So the real scandals, the real story about what's happening in this country and across the world, they don't want people to know. They don't want people to talk about. And obviously, this I think is a tactic around disinformation.
And I think the key question that you asked there was who determines what is disinformation, right? And the fact of the matter is that the people in authority will decide what is and what is not allowed. And this sounds more and more to me like 1984, where effectively the media controlled, the message is controlled, and people are controlled.
Yes. And what are lies is considered truth, and what is truth is considered lies.
Exactly right, yes. And by the way, they can change their mind over time and redefine history. And, 1984, people should go back and read that again, because whilst it's a dystopian science fiction story, at its heart is a very important message about what freedom is and who determines what truth is.
Yes. Excellent. So we're going to start going through these 10 scandals. Now, we're not going to go through them in a lot of detail because each one could take in a individual show.
And John, we should say two things. One is we're not making any of this stuff up. Every thing we're going to touch on is fully documented in the mainstream.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Firstly. Secondly, we're not accusing anybody fresh of doing anything. So we're just highlighting again stuff that's already out there in mainstream land.
Yes.
Right? But thirdly, these are things that people don't want to discuss.
Yes, yeah. So when we say they don't want to discuss, they don't want the establishment don't want these things discussed. But my argument is that some of these scandals we're going to touch on are the precise reason why people don't trust the politicians anymore.
Yep.
And because there is a huge disconnect between the establishment and the population, and this is what's driving the extremist talk on terms of social media. So let's go to the first scandal: the protection, concealment, and cover-up of pedophilia by British and American elites. So we're going to put a couple of articles, mainstream articles, up on the screen to actually highlight this. First one is Lord Mountbatten, who was the uncle of Prince Charles. FBI files have documented that he was known by the Americans as a notorious pedophile. Then we have another article talking about Jimmy Savile, 30-year career at the BBC. Again, a very close friend of Prince Charles, this is now no secret. It's openly discussed on British TV about Jimmy Savile, what he was up to, and how the BBC covered up his activities for a long, long time. And I should say there was actually a clip the other week that I saw in which the head of the Sex Pistols was being interviewed by Piers Morgan, and he gave an interview in the 70s on BBC Radio in which he alluded to Jimmy Savile, and yet he was not invited to go back on BBC Radio for a long time because he made indirect references. So this was well known throughout the entertainment industry about what was really going on, and yet swept right under the carpet. And then obviously in terms of the American context, we have Jeffrey Epstein. And again, his activities were ongoing for more than 15 years, covered up, and involving some very, very senior people. And again, not proven yet, but accusations that members of the royal family were involved in the American scandal as well. So again, I think that's a huge issue about, that we expect that justice is done and the children are protected, and yet we have found examples. And I should say, if anyone wants to look at this, people can go on YouTube, and there is a 2015 60 Minutes Australia story of a cover-up scandal or involving other people inside, former ministers, former members of the intelligence community who also were engaged in this sort of activity. And the reason why 60 Minutes Australia did that story was because no British journalist had the guts to actually do that story because it was too sensitive. Because of if you're going to actually go there and make these sort of accusations, there are repercussions. Now, for the average person doing this who is not of rank, the establishment are very comfortable cracking down on those people. But when it's within their own ranks, they want to cover it up.
And just to say, news.com and Washington Post are the sources for those, right?
Yes.
Available still on the web if people want to go look. Well,
Yeah, and obviously, if people want to look at the other clips, 60 Minutes Australia, that to me is still mainstream. Like maybe the Parliament will say that they're not mainstream anymore, but to me they're still mainstream. So that is scandal number one that I cited as why do people trust politicians less? Now, scandal number two is systemic pedophilia and child sex abuse in Australia. Now, we had a Royal Commission into this whole issue of institutional responses to abuse, and Australia's had a long history with this. It has affected tens of thousands of Australian children over the course of 50 years, and I just want to bring up the one of the main paragraphs from the executive summary of the Royal Commission final report. Quote: "We heard of child sexual abuse in institutions that span the past 90 years. Tens of thousands of children have been sexually abused in many Australian institutions. The problems have been so widespread and the nature of the abuse so heinous that it is difficult to comprehend." So we have had people in trusted authority, whether it's in children homes, orphanages, the various churches, particularly the Catholic Church, and other elements of society, where people in trusted positions did very, very, very despicable things, and that again, and obviously the Royal Commission, gave the people the opportunity to come forward with their stories, but that again, a lot of this was hush hush in this country, not to be spoken of. Children were not to be considered their allegations serious, and obviously a lot of people had, for thousands of Australians, that ruined their lives. And again, this has been it's not just, the first scandal was about overseas, but we have had this sort of issue in this country, and that is obviously diminished trust. Attendance, for example, at the Catholic Church in this country has collapsed, and there's very good reason as to people don't trust the clergy anymore, because what they did is inconsistent with the tenets of the New Testament.
Yeah. And it's sad, isn't it? Because both cases we're talking about kids, right? And how they're treated.
Yes. And
the fact is that the system actually is not on the side of the kids.
Precisely. Now, I want to go to the third scandal and again, so this third scandal is not proven, but it was a series of allegations made in federal parliament. So we had in October of 2015, the former Senator Bill Heffernan basically made an allegation that we have an elite pedophile network in this country, involving judges, involving former prime ministers, and previous Royal Commission. So in 1995, we had the Wood Royal Commission looking at the corruption in the New South Wales Police, and then we had this. We had the Royal Commission into child sex abuse and the institutional responses, starting under Julia Gillard in 2013. And Heffernan said that under both Royal Commissions, looking at this issue of corruption, anything of nefarious nature involving judges and politicians, it was off limits. Now, it's actually important because, prior to recording, I said, were you aware of this, Martin? You were not aware. Martin, let us now just play what Senator Heffernan actually had to say to Senator Ed Smith back in 2015.
We should include in the terms of reference the institution of the law. And I have documents here which the Royal Commission has seen to justify that case, and in fact every Attorney General, from Attorney General Ruddock till now, has seen some of these documents, and they are police documents, and they are very disturbing. So, having produced a set of documents to the Royal Commission under an order to produce, which includes, disturbingly, documents that name in one document 28 people as alleged pedophiles, signed off by Gary Crook QC, counsel assisting an earlier Royal Commission, includes a whole lot of prominent people, and I think to protect the discretion of the Royal Commission, I won't comment on what the Commission thought, except that they thought it was outside the terms of reference of the Royal Commission. We have in Australia, sadly, a compromise at the highest of levels. There is a former Prime Minister on this list, and it is a police document.
Well, that's pretty shocking, John, isn't it?
Indeed. And Martin, what I think is shocking about that is that, so obviously every members of Parliament have parliamentary privilege and they're allowed to say anything without facing defamation. But given how we have international scandals where these sort of things have happened overseas, and they were sort of going on for decades in both the United States and Britain, I would have thought at least Australian politicians would have said, well, in order to ensure the community that nothing of this nature is really happening and Senator Hefferna's allegations are wrong, we would actually look into these allegations, some sort of independent inquiry or Royal Commission, maybe with a foreign judge, maybe with an international jurist, just so that we can ensure that there's no conflicts of interest. And yet, since these comments have been made, which have gone like wildfire all over social media, particularly on Facebook, no one in Parliament is willing to actually say whether what Senator Heffernan said on this day is actually correct or not. And that again, when you leave this sort of allegation hanging in the air, it does raise a whole host of questions. And that's why I think if I was Prime Minister today, I would immediately call for an inquiry so that we can just, even if they're false, just to show to the public that this series of comments have no foundation in fact. But they haven't done that. And that, again, raises suspicion as to what's really going on with elite people in this country.
Yeah, and there is definitely a policy of let's not rock the boat, let's not emphasise any of this stuff. So rather than trying to say, if there's any truth, we should get to the bottom of it and quickly, right? Which is what I think the right strategy should be when these things come up, right? It's shh, don't tell anybody, right? We'll keep quiet about it and perhaps it'll go away.
Yes, absolutely. Now, scandal 4 is the forced confiscation of Australian children. Now, this was something that came up in the course of the response to COVID-19, and this was again circulating on social media, and it scared a lot of Australians about what's really going on with this response to COVID-19. Now, so this was South Australian law. In their own legislation. So let's actually put this on the screen. So again, we're not making this up. So this is from last year's legislation, which was passed by the South Australian Parliament, and it said that an authorised officer may, for the purpose of ensuring compliance with any direction under that section, remove a child from any premises, place, vehicle or vessel to a place of residence or of the child, or to a hospital or quarantine facility as the authorised officer thinks fit. Well, there are plenty of Australians who may, for example, disagree with the government's assessment of COVID-19 risk. And what if there was a disagreement between a parent and an authorised officer? Well, this law in South Australia says, well, the authorised officer can basically steal someone's child and take them away to somewhere without the parent's consent. That obviously is quite alarming, and obviously this caused enormous concern about, well, what is really going on with these federal and state government responses. And again, this is another scandal example where people don't trust government because, in the history of England, the history of Australia, actually, I should say in the history of Australia, we have had a history of confiscation of children in the Indigenous community, but the non-Indigenous community would expect that these sort of activities or these sort of laws will not actually apply to them.
Well, that concept that parents don't have paramount accountability and responsibility for their kids and basically the kids can be taken away is astonishing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So again, and I'm not sure if I didn't write to the South Australian government on this particular law, and I'm not sure if anyone did. So if anyone in the audience did write to the South Australian government to say, why did you? Because this was the only state that said we're going to confiscate your kids. So why did they put this in the law? And who thought this was a good idea? So if anyone wrote to the South Australian government and actually got a response, please send it to us because I would be fascinated to know what is the public policy justification for confiscating children. Now, in the UK, we had a huge scandal around what they call British grooming gangs. So this was in select parts of England, particularly controlled by Labor councils, and I'm not being too partisan in that, but that is what has come out on the public record. There were certain groups of an ethnic nature who were abusing young British girls, thousands of them, and the local councils and the local police turned a blind eye, and that child abuse happened for several years, and now it's fully come out as to what the nature is. But again, not only has that diminished confidence in England, I think when Australians look at what's happening among Western countries, including our mother country, which is England, given that we're still under the crown, that again that brings questions about, well, what is really happening in terms of what our governments, what our police forces are doing, and can we really trust that they're actually upholding the rule of law? Now, obviously, because you are from England and you are a dual citizen, I don't know if you've got any special comments about this particular scandal.
I'll just make one point, John. Through the process of this coming to light, there was a period where in the mainstream media they never touched it.
Precisely.
Right? So whether that was being controlled by, top down from the political sphere, or whether it was actually their own view that they didn't want to get into trouble by doing it. But for a long time, anybody who wanted to talk about this stuff could not do it through the mainstream media.
Yes, and I have to say that given the history of the BBC in terms of Jimmy Savile, the fact that not only the police were unwilling to actually enforce the rule of law, all the local councils, you had the British press, including the BBC, who basically allowed young British girls to be sexually assaulted, and yet no one said anything. And again, what is really going on in Australia? What's really going on in the UK?
Yeah, and I think the real concern there was that they used the excuse of we need to be careful about these racial issues and we don't want to inflame racial tensions as the reason for not going close to it.
Well, I mean, look, I'm not sure who came up with the saying, but I don't think two wrongs make a right.
Exactly. Yep.
Now, scandal number 6, forced mandatory vaccination. Now, in the context of the current environment, this is a very hot topic. But again, under Western Australian law, so again, let's put this on the screen just to show people we are not making this up. But under Western Australian law, let me just quote this. This is Section 158 of the Public Health Act 2016. If an authorised officer gives a direction to a person under Section 157(1)(j) to undergo medical observation, medical examination, or medical treatment, or to be vaccinated, an authorised officer or police officer may use reasonable force to ensure that the direction is complied with. Now, the section goes on, and people can look this up. Again, this is the law of Western Australia. But again, when people think that we have freedom, and you have a state government says that a police officer or a authorised officer, which is effectively a bureaucrat, has the power to use force to make you take a needle that the government says you must take, that again raises concerns about, well, what's the government really doing? Can I really trust these bureaucrats and these politicians who are paid by the taxpayer with large salaries, that they're actually looking after looking after the public interest? Now, again, on this particular issue, I have not written to the Western Australian government, but if some of our audience from Western Australia would like to, if they have, I'd like to know why this is actually in the law. If no one from Western Australia has written to Premier McGowan, I would invite people to write to the Premier and say, why is it in your state law that you have the power to basically pin someone down, put a needle into their arm, and inject them with whatever you think is appropriate? I mean, that to me is an absolute scandal.
Yep. Personal choice, personal freedom? No, forget it.
Indeed. Now, scandal number 7. Operation Mockingbird. Now, just in terms of a backdrop, so there was a lot of heated discussion in the United States during the 1970s about the activities of law enforcement and the intelligence community. Now, in 1976, there was a senator called Frank Church, and he established the Church Committee. In that committee, where they had 2 years of investigation, they exposed a lot of the secrets and tactics of the CIA, the FBI, and in terms of the NSA. Now, one of the things that was revealed after this investigation was by Carl Bernstein. So if people remember Carl Bernstein, he was part of the Watergate, who broke the Watergate scandal. He wrote a lengthy article, which is on the internet still today. I've got a copy, we'll put up on the screen, in which he talked about Operation Mockingbird. So what is this operation? This is intelligence community infiltration into the American press, in which they control what the media tells the public. And now people, I think, are aware that there is a controlled narrative that the media tries to communicate to the public. But for several decades, people were quite unaware as to how entangled the media and the intelligence community, particularly in the United States, were. So let me give you some tactics of what actually happened. So there were some secret agreements between media companies and the CIA, in which they would push the talking points of the CIA at the orders of the CIA, and some of these were written agreements, some of these were verbal agreements between senior CIA officials and media executives. Another tactic was they would recruit journalists. And it wasn't just that journalists were willing to do favors for the CIA. The CIA would actually have journalists on the payroll. So they're effectively getting two incomes. Another tactic was that the CIA would train their own agents to be journalists and then to go out into the media, and they would be actually perceived to be professional journalists, but they were actually agents for the CIA and no one actually knew. So there was a whole host of tactics that Operation Mockingbird has happened, and to the best of my knowledge, the operation has never been publicly. It's never been publicly stated that the operation ever stopped. So to what extent is the intelligence services intermingled with the media? That is hard to know. But I can say, because this is actually on the public record, that when it comes to, for example, with the BBC in the UK, all employment at the BBC is reviewed by the security services. And if there is anyone at the BBC that is pushing a point of view that MI5 or MI6 is uncomfortable with, those people are no longer employed. And that review process by the intelligence services in the UK, that again is on the public record. Now, to what extent is our Australian media intermingled with our intelligence services? Who knows? I have suspicions, but I have no proof. But again, given that we can see internationally, there has been a specific planned operation to infiltrate the press and to effectively systematically lie to the public. This again undermines confidence in the citizenry of any country to trust their own government and to trust their own media.
Yeah, and it's very worrying if you think of that intersection between the media and the security services, right? And essentially messages being influenced, because it's non-transparent. You don't know. Exactly.
So now we obviously, like I don't want to spend like a lot of time on this, but obviously in the context of the Iraq War in 2003, we had weapons of mass destruction, which ended up which was proven not to be true, and there was a full-scale inquiry in the UK basically saying that the intelligence relied on to justify the war. It was basically false. So again, a pack of lies were sold to multiple nations to justify the war, and now we learn that WMD in Iraq wasn't a real story.
Yeah, and in the UK, there were a small number of people who basically ended up taking the blame for it, right? So the overall, the overall structure and that interaction really never came out. So it was sort of deflected away.
Yep. Now we move on to Scandal 8. So Scandal 8 is Operation Northwoods. So again, let's put this up on the screen. Now, under the presidency of John F. Kennedy, there was a plan by the senior ranks of the US military to conduct a false flag operation in certain cities in the United States. So what is a false flag operation? It is when an attack occurs within your own borders, done by your own side, on purpose to make your population angry that you can justify a foreign military action. So in this case, the CIA and the Department of Defense wanted to go after Castro after Castro took over Cuba. And one of the plans they had come up with, which was actually presented to President Kennedy, was that they were going to actually bomb and kill their own citizens to justify a full-scale invasion of Cuba. Now, when that went up to JFK, he said this was completely mad, and the Operation North was rejected. But again, this is not the only example of false flag operations, but this is now on the public record that there was a suggestion, a plan, not just a documented plan to kill Americans by Americans in order to justify a foreign war. And that, again, when people, again, in this sort of great awakening process of learning these things on the internet, they're thinking, well, what is my government actually really doing and thinking? And you know, again, what is the real agenda, on particularly when it comes to international affairs?
Yeah. That, of course, is the old question, isn't it? We only know a certain amount. We don't know the full story on so many things that might be going on.
Indeed. Now, I'm going to talk about this next scandal, which actually a lot of people in Australia don't even know actually happened. But the first time I learned about this was actually through British newspapers.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an Israeli covert immigrant birth control program. So under Israeli law, if you are a Jew, you have the right to come into Israel because this is the homeland of all Jews around the world. Now, obviously there was the 12 tribes of Israel. One of the tribes went to Africa. So there is actually a large African Jewish community, and a number of them, particularly from Ethiopia, decided to travel back to Israel. Now, when they came to Israel as immigrants, as returned Jews, they were basically cajoled or encouraged or sometimes intimidated to take a certain injection, which they were told was an immunization program. But what was actually in those needles was actually birth control. And so elements of Israeli society who were studying changes in the Israel's population noticed that among Ethiopian Jews in Israel, the birth rate had collapsed. And people were wondering, well, that seems odd. Well, why is that? And when people actually investigated that story, they realized that they were given a drug that they were never told about. Now, again, this is not me making this up. This was not only, and I should say, this is not just reported by the British press, but also Israeli media companies have actually acknowledged this. Now, what was the intent of this scandal? I don't know. But obviously, when it comes to our current discussion about vaccination, there are various people who are very uncomfortable about, well, are we being told the real story or not? But by our government and by governments around the world. But again, when people look at the behaviour of foreign governments giving people things without telling them what they're actually giving, this raises concerns about, well, can we trust our own people? And again, I'm not making any accusations in the Australian context, but again, I think politicians and medical officials need to be sensitive that when a scandal breaks, particularly in the 21st century, if a scandal breaks overseas, people start to think of, well, is that scandal just relevant to that jurisdiction, or is that scandal relevant to my jurisdiction?
Borders are more porous than they were, and stories go across the world much more easily and effectively. You've got to ask questions. You've got to ask deeper questions than perhaps ever before. Indeed.
Now, the last scandal is something that we have talked about quite a bit. Is the corruption in the banks, and so we're just to highlight, in this case we're highlighting the Hayne Royal Commission into the financial services community. But there's a long list of scandals that have happened among banks and financial institutions across the world. But there's just a key quote from the final report of the Hayne Royal Commission that I just want to bring up. So let's put this on the screen. It says, quote, "Conduct by many entities that has taken place over many years, causing substantial loss to many customers but yielding substantial profits to the entities concerned. Very often the conduct has broken the law. Too often financial services entities that broke the law were not properly held to account." Yep. So again, this is another example as to, well, if the banks can do whatever they want, if they can fleece the Australian people and they can make these super profits and line their own pockets through executive bonuses, etc., and the regulators, whether it's ASIC, APRA, RBA, Treasury, etc., and parliamentarians, if they're not actually going to look after the Australian consumer, why should I trust them? So again, this is another clear example of why trust has collapsed. And when trust has collapsed, people are more susceptible to thinking more perhaps more suspicious thoughts. So I will, without disclosing names, I had a conversation with someone the other day by phone who thinks that there is a very elaborate plan by our government to do some very nasty things to Australians across the country. Now, I don't think that plan has any foundation in like any basis in fact, and I don't think this particular theory that this person expressed to me is actually true. But I can see why when you start to look at all these scandals and how, particularly, for example, the Banking Royal Commission or with the Royal Commission into institutional responses to sexual abuse, when you have Australian authorities looking the other way for so long on so many cases, it actually invites people to think the worst of our officials in our government. And again, this is the key point I wanted to make. And these 10 scandals. Now, I've listed a whole bunch of more, but these are the scandals I said that people need to acknowledge and actually come to grips with if you want to rebuild trust in the community. And yet the committee says that these are the types of things that cannot be discussed in this country. And they will not publish it on the inquiry website.
Yeah, and the whole point of this conversation, John, is the trust deficit, right?
That's right.
The trust deficit is the critical point. So essentially, politicians, those in authority, have lost the support of the community, and we don't trust them, and they continue to demonstrate by their behaviour and by what they do and what they don't do that we should not trust them.
Precisely. And I would even go a step further and argue that the behaviour of Parliament is actually fueling extremism. So, we are told that in a democratic society that we should use non-violent civil means to resolve differences in terms of grievances. And so on this occasion, that's what I attempted to do. There was an inquiry, there was a call for submissions. I put in what I thought was a serious submission with a lot of footnotes and evidence, and I acknowledge a very different point of view. But when it gets to the committee says it's correspondence. We don't have to consider your evidence. And what I think is key to extremist movements and radicalisation is non-responsive political systems. And on this occasion, I think we have a clear example of a political system that doesn't want to respond to scandals and things which make them uncomfortable.
Yes. They much prefer to look the other way. They much prefer to focus on their own agendas, which is more about short-term election results and getting back in, maintaining power and controlling, rather than actually dealing with those issues which are much more fundamental. And, that means that we don't actually get the sort of policies that we need to take us into the future. And it means that we don't actually trust what they're doing. And frankly, at the moment, on this evidence, we shouldn't trust them.
Absolutely. So in terms of next steps, unfortunately, I've been told that the committee's decision is final and there's nothing I can do. But what we can do is that now, since our last show, I've had quite a few emails where people have said, can you send me your submission? I'd like to read. Now, given that Parliament won't publish it, if more members of the audience would actually like to read what I actually had to say, and again, I'm happy for people to say I either agree with John Adams or that I disagree. But I don't think the truth should be suppressed. I think these things should be openly discussed. And let's put my email back on the screen for anyone to look at. And people are free to email me, and I'm happy to share it.
And John, I would say that I read it, and I don't necessarily agree with everything that you said, but I absolutely support your right to say what you said, firstly. And secondly, the fundamental question that you've posed, which is what happens when the systems that are in place actually get in the way of truth? How do we deal with that? I haven't got an answer for that, but that for me is the key question.
Indeed. So in conclusion, now maybe someone won't call this corruption. I do think that when you only accept a select slice of evidence from within the ranks of government, you're not willing to consider any evidence outside. And I should say, Martin, is that what happened to me wasn't just to me. One of my friends who also put in a submission had the same experience. it was treated as correspondence. They had a very different narrative to what the government wanted to push out about this extremism, and that it is such a critical threat. And so, we will. There are some conversations that are already happening with some members of Parliament about whether we can actually ascertain as to was this a systematic rigging of the inquiry. But to me, I would say that the fix is in, and the final report of the inquiry has already perhaps been predetermined.
Okay. John, I appreciate your time today. A very, very important subject, a very painful subject, but we will keep talking about this and in the interest of the people.
Thank you.
Martin North, John Adams, in the interest of the people. We'll see you next time.